point, and they are far more concerned about the growing unrest of the Germanic tribes on the northern frontier and the Persians on the eastern frontier. In their minds, the wheat flowing from North Africa is a given. The family is middle class, of higher social status than the farmers which make up the majority of the population, but not wealthy enough to give their newborn son, Augustine, the education that they want for him, without the help of their patron, Romanianus. The father's name is Patrick, and he is a pagan. The mother's name is Monica, and she holds closely to her Christian faith. But in accordance with common practice, she does not have her infant son baptized yet, for fear that he might sin too much afterwards. Once he's had his teenage years, he can make that choice himself and have his wild oats washed away in the water of baptism. She will almost rue that decision, because as her son grows up, he doesn't show any inclination to join the Christian faith. He leads the life of a normal teenager, juggling his studies, his friends, his sports, chasing girls, avoiding religion. She pleads and prays and worries and pleads some more, but to no avail. When he finally does start showing interest in religion, he joins a group called the Manichees, who hold to a strict dualism. Material things are bad and spiritual things are good. Darkness is bad and light is good. They go so far as to believe that divinity is a spiritual substance which is trapped inside matter, and it is the responsibility of enlightened Manichees to free the divine spirit. So, they eat fruits, specially picked, digest the matter, and thereby free the divine spirit into the atmosphere. In simpler terms, they burp and they think it's God. And this is the heresy. This is the heresy that has Augustine trapped for much of his young adult life, and his mother Monica is horrified. Augustine is in school studying rhetoric and training to be an orator, which is the ancient Roman world's version of a lawyer. Once he finishes his studies, he begins teaching rhetoric in Carthage, the central city in North Africa, a lucrative, if frustrating, profession. His students drive him crazy, and he hears rumors that the students in Rome are better behaved. Since his family's patron is able to give him the introductions he needs to further his career in the heart of the empire, he ventures off, joined by his live-in girlfriend and their son, more on her next week, and his mother Monica. His father Patrick had passed away a few years earlier. He arrives in Rome in 383. While Christianity has been legal since the time of Constantine, it has only been the official state religion of the Roman Empire for 3 years. But it's quickly moving up in the social hierarchy. Through the people around him, he begins to realizing that burping far-flung territories. The rank-and-file soldiers were not allowed to marry, so when their tour of duty was done, there wasn't much back in Italy to bring them home. Their parents were probably dead, they hadn't seen their siblings in years, and they had no wives or children back there. Instead, they had friendships with their fellow soldiers and relationships with local women that they'd met on their tour of duty. So often Roman soldiers would settle in the colonies that they had fought and conquered with their fellow soldiers and their now local wives as the foundation of the new colony. This provided a loyal population base for the Roman Empire in the midst of their newly conquered territories. From that point, the higher-ranking patricians would come to administer the government, and merchants would come, and society would build, so there would be some higher-class Romans there as well. But you didn't often have what we think of colonization, where you have groups of people moving to a new place. Roman families didn't pick up and move to a new colony, with a few exceptions. And so mostly you had people descendant either from the local tribes or from a union between a Roman soldier and a local woman. So as we think about that, the evidence that people talk about when they try to answer this question, most icons do picture him with light skin, but many Berbers do have fairly light skin, so even if he is pictured with lighter skin, it doesn't mean that he's not African. He's of a slightly higher social class, and he's not from a farming family. He also has a Roman name, a Roman patron, and a Roman education. So that's a little bit more like maybe he is Roman. But it also was common for local tribes to adapt the language and customs of the Romans because that would allow them to advance socially within the colony. So the fact that he had a Roman name and a Roman education doesn't mean that he's not African either. And there's very clearly a competing tradition within the iconography that pictures him with much darker skin. So considering the background of Roman colonies and the fact that you rarely had large numbers of Romans moving there, as a member of essentially the lower middle class in a Roman colony, it's highly likely that he's at least partially, if not fully, of African descent. And so what we have in some ways is the Western Church has a little bit whitewashed Augustine. With these pictures that I've picked to show you, I've intentionally picked really extreme examples. We'll go back to the one before. Most icons show him with light skin but darker hair, as opposed to the red hair in this picture, which makes him look like he's from Ireland or something. But one of the reasons that I show you these is because these are the pictures that show up on the books that are sold for popular consumption. The one on the right here is, or on the left from your perspective, is on the picture of the Oxford's World Classics version of Confessions, which is one of the most popularly sold. It's got a really good translation that's easy to read, and it has a picture of Augustine with red hair on it. And this next one, the one on the left, is from a biography of Augustine. And so what we have is we have, this speaks volumes about what we think sells books in Western Christianity, is white male authors. And that does take away from Augustine's heritage as an African, definitely. And although we'll never know for sure exactly what his ethnic makeup was, we do know that he was born, raised, and educated in North Africa. And although he went to Rome for a few years for his higher education before returning to North Africa, he did return and became a priest and a bishop and spent the rest of his relatively long career as ministering to the people of North Africa. And I think what's important to me is that Augustine has had an immeasurable impact on the development of theology in the Western Church, and our debt here is to the North African Church, not to Rome and the Roman Church. And I think that when we surround ourselves with these pictures of Augustine very white, we forget that he is African, and our debt here is to the North African Church. And so to think about some ways that he's kind of distinctively African in his writing, he has a gift for words and for crafting story, which is very clear in the Confessions. And there are very few works remaining from the Roman world that are akin to modern prose narrative writing. And of the three most famous, two of them came from Africa. One is a novel called The Golden Ass by Apuleius, and the other is Augustine's Confessions. And so he's definitely writing in a tradition that comes out of Africa in kind of the late imperial period. Another thing for him is that because of his rhetorical training, he thinks like an orator, and he writes like an orator, and this is very characteristic of the African church at that time, which had a really heavy emphasis on education. And he also was from a very small, tight-knit group of friends that stuck together and advanced together, and they were from Africa. And there's a really strong focus in the Confession on the narratives of his friends who also converted to Christianity, and they remained the core of his community for the rest of his career. And in his later writings, it's not apparent that he kind of made new friends, but really like maintained that really close-knit group of friends that kind of went through his conversion with him. Many of them lived in Carthage, and he remained in Hippo, but he kept those relationships really close for the remainder of his lifetime. So that gives us a little bit of a picture of who Augustine is. So next, what are the Confessions and why are they important? And I think one thing that's really important with this book is that it is innovative in a way that I think we miss as Westerners reading it in the 21st century because it doesn't seem innovative to us. But when Augustine wrote this style of book had never been written before. It was the first of its kind in Latin literature. It's basically a stream of consciousness, soul-searching narrative. And the soul-searching style seems normal to the Western mind because we are kind of enveloped in that in our culture, that idea of like, who am I? What is my purpose in life? That surrounds us as a normal question to be asking. It's part of growing up. But Augustine is the one who started it all. He's the first one that wrote something like this, at least that survives for us. And he takes the soul-searching stream of consciousness and that personal narrative, and in that, he weaves multiple types of writing. We've got rhetoric, we've got theology, we have philosophy, and we have other narrative. And so, as you're reading, you've got all of these different styles of writing woven together as he tells the story of his conversion in a really beautiful way. So, rhetoric. As I said before, Augustine trained as an orator in the law court. And what this meant, learning how to be persuasive with words. Orators were trained in sophistry, and to sophists, being able to convince your audience was more important than speaking what was true. Yeah. And he really struggles with this, and you see that throughout the Confessions, that he's kind of looking back at this training and saying, was this like really actually valuable? He leaves this career, but that training stays with him throughout the rest of his career. As much as he leaves the law court and enters the church, he remains an orator to the core. And so he kind of wrestles with this and tries to distance himself from it. But there's this quote from really early on in the book. As he's writing, he speaks directly to the reader of the book. He's very aware of his audience, and it's almost as if you're sitting right in front of him as he pours his heart out to you, and that's kind of indicative of his rhetorical training. You're not distant, you're right there. He also oftentimes talks to God during the book as he's writing. And in the very beginning, there's this quote where he pictures himself as standing before God, making his case as a lawyer would. But he kind of realizes, like, this isn't useful. I can't do this. And so he makes a distinction between addressing God's law and addressing God's mercy. And he sort of says, like, my capacity as an orator is not enough. And so I'm going to kind of maintain that capacity, but ask to address your mercy instead of your law. And here's the quote. I do not contend with you in a court of law, for you are the truth. I do not deceive myself, lest my iniquity lie to itself. Therefore I do not contend with you like a litigant, because if you take note of iniquities, Lord, who will stand? Nevertheless, allow me to speak before your mercy, though I am but dust and ashes. Allow me to speak, for I am addressing your mercy, not a man who would laugh at me. So he's simultaneously rejecting his oratorical training and saying, no, that's not what I'm doing, but then kind of recognizes that he's doing it anyways. And so that continues throughout the book. The next type of writing that we see is very clear theological writing. In this book, he is working out theological ideas that he will build on for the remaining 3 decades of his career. Through his tale of his obsession with the Manichees, which we're not going to focus on very much in these 2 talks, but as he talks about how he came out of those beliefs and into Christian beliefs, and how he came to know the truth of who God was, he is very clearly weaving these theological concepts in throughout the book. After the narrative portion of the book is done, there's several more chapters, and he includes reflections on time and eternity, creation, free will, evil, and the inherent goodness of matter, God's unchanging nature, the Trinity. He kind of takes everything and works it in some way or another. So a very clear purpose of the book is theological instruction, but he weaves it in so beautifully with the rest of his writing that you almost don't know you're being instructed. So then the philosophy element. Many authors actually argue that Augustine's first conversion was not to Christianity but to philosophy. When he was in his late teens, he read a book by Cicero called Hortensius, and he fell in love with it. And he felt like, although it was over 10 years before he actually converted to Christianity, he later saw that moment as really foundational for his life. And this is what he says about that book. The book changed my feelings. It altered my prayers, Lord, to be towards you yourself. It gave me different values and priorities. Suddenly, every vain hope became empty to me, and I longed for the immortality of wisdom with an incredible ardor in my heart. I was impressed not by the book's refining effect on my style and literary expression, but by the content. And so you see him like starting to understand this love of thinking, this love of learning, this love of wisdom that would stay with him for the remainder of his life. And the Confessions and Augustine's other works are all studied in secular context for their philosophical validity, separate from their theological points. And so how he tackles the problem of evil and free will, memory again. He talks a lot about what's time and what is matter and what's the relationship between time and matter, and some other topics. And this is, as I said before, the context in which I studied the Confessions. So you guys will see a little bit of that emphasis here. Towards the end of this week, we're going to look at one of his formal philosophical arguments about the nature of evil, which I think is really fascinating. So hopefully you guys will too. And then the last part of the Confessions is its narrative. It is his spiritual autobiography. The Confessions are above all a story, and Augustine is a storyteller. It's the story of his life, but also of his friends' lives, of his frenemies' lives, the lives of people whom he's never met but have made an impact on him. You just see all of these stories woven in over and over again during the book. So we learn about his teenage companions and how they influenced him for good and for bad. He talks about a boyhood friend who died at a young age and just left him completely and totally destroyed, completely bereft. We learn about his mom and his dad and his somewhat complicated relationship with his mom, who was far more clingy and manipulative than he would like. We meet his friend Alypius and hear about his addiction to the gladiatorial games. We learn about his live-in girlfriend and his son. We see him meet the acclaimed Ambrose. And more than anything, we hear stories of saints, of men and women who inspire Augustine on his journey and who he hopes will inspire his congregation, who he's writing this for on their journeys. His purpose in writing the Confessions is that he's building a narrative of his conversion that has a clear purpose: the instruction of his congregation in an understanding of the theology of sin and grace. And this theology eventually will become the bedrock of the Western Church's teaching on sin and grace, and is just beautifully illustrated through his conversion story. So that's a little background on the Confessions to get a sense of what the book is from start to finish. But now to the happy life. So this is Augustine's search for happiness is the central theme of the whole of the Confessions. What are men and women living for? What do they love? Why do they make the decisions that they make? We see Augustine examining every aspect of his life as he searches for God. In some ways, the end result is a given. His mother Monica raised him in the Catholic faith, and after he wandered away into the arms of the Manichees, she prayed for him incessantly until he found Christianity on his own. She was even given a vision of him standing next to her on the end of a long ruler, which the Bishop Ambrose interpreted for her as meaning that Augustine would eventually come to a knowledge of the Christian faith. But Augustine presents his spiritual journey in some ways as a series of dead ends. Rhetoric, philosophy, sex, marriage, children, money, as he figures out on his own how he's going to arrive at the right end, or more accurately, how God brings him to arrive at the right end regardless of anything that he does. He thinks that each of these dead ends will make him happy, but he realizes that he is miserable regardless of how hard he has tried to do each thing that the world tells him will make him happy. This is summed up in the first paragraph of the Confessions, which has been made famous by being quoted over and over again. Nevertheless, to praise you is the desire of man, a little piece of your creation. You stir man to take pleasure in praising you, because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. A lot of the Confessions is about sin. It's a theme that Augustine comes back to over and over again. Each failed attempt to find the happy life for Augustine is a case of disordered loves. If he has failed to find God, it is because he has loved something out of proportion to itself. He has thought something would make him happy, thrown himself into it, and found it lacking because he loved it too much. This happens over and over again for Augustine, and he feels caught. He feels like he can never do without these little things that he loves. He knows that resting in God is ultimately what will make him happy, but he cannot seem to abandon the restlessness that keeps drawing him back in. I have divided my talk down into two parts, essentially the problem and the solution. We'll dive into the problem in this first week, and then the solution next week. He develops a deep, strong theology of sin throughout the Confessions, and many of the narratives he tells show people struggling with different sins. To understand Augustine's journey to true happiness, we must start with his definition of sin and evil. And to refer back to Fleming's class, she discussed the idea of corporate sin, that there are systemic evils in this world for which we are all responsible and in which we all take part. And Augustine plays into this idea through his doctrine of original sin, that sin is something which every human being inherits as part of the package of humanity. His example to prove the idea of original sin is that even young babies are not immune to being greedy if they see one of their siblings drinking milk at their mother's breast. Even if they've already had something to eat, you can just see the desire in that little baby's eyes to have what their sibling is having. But as Augustine writes the Confessions, he also treats sin individually. These are specific acts done by specific people who are now, in his words, problems unto themselves, because in their search for happiness, they are caught in webs of misery. So, to look at Augustine's definition of sin a little bit more closely. According to Augustine, sin is disordered love. In other words, sin is loving something out of proportion to its actual value. He sees essentially a pyramid that places God at the top and created beings on the bottom, and every created being has its specific place within the pyramid. Humans are worth more than animals because they have souls. Animals are worth more than inanimate objects because they're living beings. Some inanimate objects are worth more than others because of what they are used for or their innate value. He also places concepts like beauty and glory and justice on the pyramid. And this idea of the pyramid is also seen in other places in philosophical literature from this time. So he's working with some pretty big philosophical ideas here. But for him, we humans sin when we love something lower on the pyramid more than something higher on the pyramid. We sin when we value an inanimate object more than a human being. We sin when we love a created person more than we love the Creator himself. And here's a quote from in Augustine's own words of what he means by this. And this is actually the first quote on your handout if you want to follow along. It's a little bit longer. There is beauty in lovely physical objects, as in gold and silver and all other such things. Temporal honor and the power of giving orders and of being in command have their own kind of dignity. The life we live in this world has its attractiveness because of a certain measure in its beauty and its harmony with all these inferior objects which are beautiful. Human friendship is also a nest of love and gentleness because of the unity it brings about between many souls. Yet sin is committed for the sake of all these things and others of this kind when, in consequence of an immoderate urge towards those things which are at the bottom end of the scale of good, we abandon the higher and supreme goods, that is you, Lord God, your truth and your law. These inferior goods have their delights, but not comparable to my God who has made them all. So the philosophical basis for this theory of disordered love is in the idea that everything has goodness in it. Everything that is created should be loved somewhat because it contains the inherent goodness of creation in itself. But when those goods are in conflict with each other, sometimes we have to choose one over the other, even though both may be good. For instance, we value living beings because we recognize that there is beauty and worth in God's creation. But if a mosquito's biting us, we don't feel guilty about killing it. We value not having an itchy red welt over the life of a mosquito because it's a lower order being and there are plenty to make up for that one. On the other hand, we would find it much more difficult to kill a pesky mammal. Something would just feel wrong about picking up a squirrel and breaking its neck, even if it were trying to steal your food at a picnic. It's higher on this pyramid of goods, and so we value it more than we do something else. For another example, the sin of pride seeks after honor and glory. But there's nothing inherently wrong with honor or glory. We constantly celebrate people's achievements, from spelling bee awards to Olympic medals. Seeking after honor and glory becomes wrong. It becomes the sin of pride when we seek the honor and glory that should be God's and not our own. And so again, it's a created good. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's the misuse of it that becomes sin. And this definition of sin helps clarify why we do things that we think will make us happy, but end up making us miserable. Because created goods have value, it makes sense that we think we'll be happy when we love one of them. But if we're loving it out of proportion to its value, it's just not going to make us happy. There's going to be that ache of understanding that something's not the way it was created to be. But then the question is it really true that every bad decision every human being makes is driven by loving something God has created, even if it is out of proportion to its value? It's everything we do, every sin can somehow be boiled down to the idea that there is something good that you're aiming for and you're just missing the mark. The Joker would tell us no. The Joker is the perfect anti-hero. He loves chaos and disorder. This is Heath Ledger playing the Joker in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, which is one of my all-time favorite movies. And this particular portrayal of the Joker exemplifies the perfect antithesis to Augustine's definition of love. If we can find someone like this in real life, it means that Augustine's definition of sin is disordered love. So if we can find something like this in real life, then we kind of have to throw Augustine's definition out the window. Because the Joker's whole thing throughout the movie is that he doesn't care about anything except for chaos and disorder, except for the destruction of things that are good. There's one conversation that he has with a character where they're asking him about what he's trying to do with his plan, and he says, "Do I look like a man with a plan?" And he compares himself to a dog. He's like, I'm like a dog chasing a car. If I caught it, I wouldn't know what to do with it. If he gets at what he's aiming for, then he's kind of missed his whole point. There's another really great scene where he's kind of allied himself with the mobsters, and they haven't really had a choice in this alliance, but it has produced a ton of money through this robbery that they did. And he calls all the mobsters into one place, and all of the money is piled in this massively huge pile. And he's talking to the mobsters, and they're thinking, okay, like now we're getting our cut, and we'll go separate ways, and we don't have to deal with this crazy freak anymore. And his henchmen come out and start pouring gasoline all over the money. You see the mobsters getting really nervous. Like, what is he doing? And then he lights this match and throws it on the money. And they're like, wait, that's our money. And he's like, well, I'm only burning my half. So he's not doing it with a plan. He's not doing it for the money. And Alfred has this great quote where he kind of summarizes the Joker in one sentence where he says, "Some men just want to watch the world burn." And some men in this particular, so some men just want to see the destruction of things that are good, essentially is what he's saying. And although Augustine didn't have to worry about the Joker, he's still questioning his definition and trying to come up with an example that would challenge it. The beginning of the Confessions, the first few, what they call books in the Confessions, the smaller chapters, he's kind of going through his boyhood and tracing some of the things that he did as a young child that are considered wrong and evaluating them according to this theory of sin. And when he hits his teenage years, he remembers a story which he's not sure that he can fit into this paradigm of disordered loves. This is his Joker moment. What does he do that's so outrageous? He steals pears from a pear tree in an orchard. The pear tree. So here in his own words is how he describes what he and his friends did. And this is also on your handout if you want to follow along. "Wickedness filled me. I stole something which I had in plenty and of much better quality. My desire was to enjoy not what I sought by stealing, but merely the excitement of thieving and the doing of what was wrong. There was a pear tree near our vineyard laden with fruit, though attractive in neither color nor taste. To shake the fruit off the tree and carry off the pears, I and a gang of naughty adolescents set off late at night after, in our usual pestilential way, we had continued our game in the streets. We carried off a huge load of pears, but they were not for our feast, but merely to throw to the pigs. Even if we ate a few, nevertheless our pleasure lay in doing what was not allowed." So right now, Augustine is setting up what philosophers call a thought experiment, which is when you set up a scenario that's perfectly crafted to challenge an argument that you're trying to make. Philosophers have been doing this for thousands of years. But generally when they do it, it's entirely hypothetical. And this is one of Augustine's things in the Confessions, is to take a thought experiment and make it very personal, something that happened to him. And the riddle here is precisely this. is there some created good that Augustine loved when he stole the pears? Or did he do it simply because he loved wickedness itself? And it might seem like a trivial question, but if he did it because he loved evil, it destroys his entire definition of sin. Because if you can love something which is not a created good, then he's got to come up with a new definition because it doesn't fit into his paradigm of disordered love. So he considers the two separate possibilities. First, did he love wickedness itself? He says very clearly that his act had no beauty in itself, not even a corrupted beauty. He didn't do it for the sake of pears, because he had better ones at home. He didn't do it because he was hungry. Even if he did eat one or two, there was no need for him to consume food. He didn't do it because he needed the pears for something, because he threw them away. Based on this, it looks like he did this not for a lower order created good, but for love of wickedness itself. So his definition of sin is in danger here. But then he brings up the possibility that he did it out of peer pressure. And this again is on your handout. Yet had I been alone, I would not have done it. I remember my state of mind to be thus at the time. Alone I would never have done it. Therefore, my love in the act was to be associated with the gang in whose company I did it. So Augustine plays with this idea for a bit, still wondering if he really loved wickedness. But he keeps coming back to the fact that he wouldn't have done it if he'd been by himself. He would have found no pleasure in the crime by himself. So therefore, he had to love something more than wickedness. And what it was that elusive feeling of companionship. Definitely distorted here because the companionship drove him to theft and destruction of property, but still there was that feeling of companionship that he was so desperately seeking as a young teenager. Augustinian scholars are divided on the answer to this thought experiment. Some believe that he does come to the conclusion that he loved the wickedness itself, and that although the friendship was a necessary condition to committing the act, it didn't change the fact that he loved the wickedness and not the friendship. Others believe that he loved the friendship, which is a good which fits into the pyramid of goodness that Augustine proposes, as we said above. And I personally think that the argument that he did it for the sake of his friendships is compelling as you read through that portion of the Confessions. And as we'll see later on, it provides this sense of continuity to his overall view of sin and his arguments about the nature of evil. So, to kind of recap where we're at, we have this world with a lot of good created things in it. And we have all of us people going around loving these good things that God created. And this seems like it should be a recipe for happiness. It seems like it should work. But as Augustine points out, it doesn't. He goes off and steals pears and throws them to pigs to impress his friends and is miserable afterwards. We go off and do lots of things that we think will make us happy, and they just don't. So where is the disconnect? If everything around us is good, where does the misery come from? And what makes us love things out of proportion to their value? Augustine has to go a long time after his pear-stealing years before he comes to an understanding of this to answer these questions. So it's actually much later on in the book that he starts digging into the questions about the problem of evil. But when he starts to make a philosophical argument about this, his end point is that evil is a nothing. And yes, you read that correctly and you heard me correctly. He's trying to prove that evil is a nothing. In other words, it has no being or substance. This might seem like a nonsensical statement. It also might seem a little heretical, since all of Christianity is focused around the idea that Jesus conquered evil. And how can you conquer something that is a nothing? And why is Augustine so worked up about sin if it's a nothing? Stay with me for a minute, and I'll hopefully show you why this argument is essential for his definition of sin being part of his sin being about disordered love. And if I lose you, don't worry about it too much because it's not essential to understanding the talk or being happy. So philosophical arguments are based on premises, and they can be anything from definitions to propositions about how the world works. When you're evaluating a philosophical argument, if you can prove that a premise is not true, then you've defeated the argument. Because of this, when you're writing an argument, it's best to make the premises as simplistic and self-evident as possible. If you go read the Confessions, which I hope you guys do, you won't find any arguments written out like this. I wrote this one in a more formal philosophical form from 2 paragraphs in Confessions, Book 7. Augustine is far more eloquent and well-written. I'm just boiling it down. And obviously, any errors are my own. So this is on the back of your handout, also up there. So the first premise of this argument is to be corrupted is to be made less good. This is simply by definition. Corruption means that a thing or substance is not as good as it was before. The second premise, if X can be corrupted, if a being, a substance, can be corrupted, then that substance is good. Because if a substance is able to lose goodness, which is our definition of corruption, if it's able to be made less good, it has to have goodness to start with. So anything that can be corrupted has goodness in it. If X cannot be corrupted, then it is permanently incorruptible. So if it can't be corrupted, there's never going to be a time where it can be corrupted. So being incorruptible is a state that a being or a substance has forever. And this is by definition, but he's just trying to make a point that it's incorruptibility is a permanent state. Because once you can be corrupted at all, it means you are never incorruptible to start with. Fourth premise, it is better to be incorruptible than to be corruptible. This is where he starts leaving the realm of definitions and getting into a slightly deeper premise. And so it may be possible to come up with an example of something that is better as a corruptible being than an incorruptible being. I haven't been able to do it yet, but if you can come up with an example that disproves that premise, then you can disprove his theory about evil. So the next 2 premises, I'll read them and then I'll explain what's going on because they get a little bit more complicated. The reductio ad absurdum. Premise number 5. If substance Y has substance and has no goodness, it cannot be corrupted. So if it's fully evil, if there's no goodness in it, it can't lose any goodness because it didn't have any to start with. Premise 6. Thus Y, without any goodness, is better than if it had a little goodness. Because if it's got a little bit of goodness in it, then it can be corrupted. And if it has no goodness in it, then it can't be corrupted. And it's better to not be corrupted, to not be able to be corrupted, than to be corrupted. What a reductio ad absurdum argument does is it takes a series of premises and shows that you can create an absurdity with the premises. So the absurdity that's created by this argument is that a substance without any goodness is better than if it has just a little bit of goodness. Because if it has no goodness, then it's incorruptible. And if it has some goodness, it's corruptible. This is absurd. Why would we say that something with no goodness is better than something with a little bit of goodness? So we take this absurdity that we've created and make another premise that says the opposite of it. Because if it's absurd, then we should be able to say that the opposite is true. And so our next premise, if a substance exists, it has to have some goodness in it, comes from the reductio ad absurdum. So if X has substance, X has at least some goodness. The final premise, evil, by definition, is not good. So therefore, evil has no substance. Because if it has no goodness in it, it has nothing there, then it can't have any substance. The translation that I'm working out of actually says that evil does not exist, and it used those words. But that's not what Augustine is saying. And as he continues to write, because he lays out this argument and then he writes along a lot more about it, and he continues to kind of noodle in his brain with what he's arguing, he softens the evil does not exist to evil does not have substance, or evil is a nothing. And that's closer to the philosophical meaning of the Latin verb esse, which means to be or to exist, that it's about having substance, having being. He's not trying to say that there is no evil in the world. That's not what he's getting at. He's trying to say that God has created a perfectly good creation. He did not make any substance or any matter or any being that was not good. Everything in creation has an order, and everything in creation can be loved for itself in its appropriate order, as long as it's not loved too much. Sin and evil enter the world when we corrupt the goodness around us by using it inappropriately. They are not in the world because God created them. They are in the world because we as humans are incapable of loving things in appropriate ways. We see a created good, we think it will make us happy, and we go for it. In Augustine's words, and this is also on your handout, I inquired what wickedness is, and I did not find a substance, but a perversity of will twisted away from the highest substance, you, O God, towards inferior things, rejecting its own inner life and swelling with external matter. Another story that Augustine tells that illustrates this concept is about the death of his childhood best friend. This boy died as a young man, probably in his late teens. He had a fever and was close to death and then recovered, and everyone thought he was going to be okay. And Augustine, who had kind of been like by his bedside every moment of his illness, left because he was better. And then he relapsed and died a few days later, very suddenly. And Augustine's grief almost destroyed him. As he describes it, everything on which I set my gaze was death. My hometown became a torture to me. My father's house, a strange world of unhappiness. All that I had shared with him was without him transformed into a cruel torment. My eyes looked for him everywhere, and he was not there. I had become to myself a vast problem. But later, as he analyzes his state of mind and understands his unhappiness, he is able to place this grief within his conception of disordered loves. The reason why that grief had penetrated me so easily and deeply was that I had poured out my soul onto the sand by loving a person sure to die as if he would never die. His love for his friend was disordered, not because it was wrong to love him, and not because his friend himself was bad, but because he loved him out of proportion to the proper order of things. He was a mortal being, and Augustine loved him as if he were immortal, and as if he could depend on him forever. The evil, the wrong in the situation is not in any of the created goods. It's not in his deceased friend, it's not in their friendship, it's not in his love for his friend. All of these are created goods that rightfully made Augustine happy while his friend was alive. The wrong is in the twisting of Augustine's will towards a created good, away from the higher good of God. And this is ultimately what destroyed Augustine's happiness here. So where does this leave Augustine in his search for happiness? With his philosophical bent, it's pretty clear. If he can just train his mind to acknowledge each substance's correct place in the paradigm of loves and love it appropriately, he will find happiness. If disordered loves are the causes of his grief, then he just has to stop those disordered loves. Piece of cake, right? But as Augustine will eventually figure out, that's much easier said than done, which probably has something to do about the perversity of will that he talks about as he explores the problem of evil. That we, as human beings, have a will that is not directed towards God. So next week, we'll see as, in succession, his career, his philosophy, and his love life all fail to give him the happiness and rest for which he's looking. And we will see how he finally answers his burning question: who will grant me that you come to my heart and intoxicate it, so that I forget my evils and embrace my one and only good, yourself? Thank you for listening. think we have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Just in that last sentence or two, my mind was going in circles. I tried to make it up. Did he use the concept of power at all?
He does talk about the concept of power. And I think that would fall into like the example of honor and glory, that like
How about perversity?
that power, if power is loved in the appropriate dimension, then there's nothing inherently wrong with it. Obviously, God has ultimate power. God is the one who is able to do anything, and that we as human beings are given power maybe relative to our place in the world. Like governments have power, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. They're given power, But so as long as you're not abusing the power, as long as you're not using it for wrong, then there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's still a created good because you can use your power to do good things. But as soon as you abuse it or love it out of proportion or take more than is rightfully yours, that's when the sin enters. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't hear your question. Yeah, I'm not totally sure how to answer that one. Sorry. It stumped me. Another question. Yeah.
What do you think he's referring to when he says swelling with external matter?
That is getting back to his Manichaean beliefs, where he's the tension between like matter that's bad and the spiritual things that are good. And so he's basically saying that like if you're swelling with external matter, then that's a bad thing. But he's inherently criticizing that belief as he's answering it. Because he rejects the dualism of the Manichaees.
I'm just curious, as you put the pear tree, and that was great. I've heard some people, I don't know where they get this, but some people say the pear in the ancient world is a symbol of sexuality. So he's kind of doing two things at once there. What do you think of that? And if so, that seems pretty interesting. But what do you make of that?
I think that yes, he probably is doing two things at once there. The question of sexuality runs throughout the entire Confessions. It for him is the one thing that he can't give up. And so I think, and he refers to his antics as a young child, not a young child, but as like a teenager. And we're going to talk more about how sexuality shows up in the Confessions next week. It's going to become more of a theme. But I think that the idea of he really sees himself as loving sexuality like out of proportion to its value. I think that if you're comparing sexuality to the pears in the pear tree, I think that like there is a sense in which Augustine never really reconciles himself to his sexuality because he embraces this life of celibacy. He sees his relationship with his living girlfriend as kind of inherently wrong, even though it was but I feel like we're getting into stuff for next week. But I think like you could look at it that if you're interpreting the pear tree as being an example of him loving wickedness itself, you could connect that to essentially his sex drive, because he really sees that as a really negative thing. But I think you could also kind of give Augustine a little grace in that area and take a more modern view of sexuality in which it is a healthy thing as long as it's used appropriately, and still see it with being connected to the pear tree if you're going to interpret the pear tree as being about him loving something besides wickedness. Did that make sense?
Well, moving from sex to mothers,
I don't know what that means, but anyway, if you go into the chapel of the Holy Cross, you look over the window that was put in for a Mother's Day, and there's an image on the top of Constantine and his mother, and then Augustine and his mother, and because the mothers prayed for them in their journey and so through faith. And so you want to take a look at that on the way and think about Augustine. It's great. This was amazing, Margie. So good. Yeah.
If you have more questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes. You can come up and ask me. Thank you guys so much for coming.